John and Alice had been married for 40 years, a lifetime spent raising their 2 kids, Emily and David, and enjoying the fruits of their hard work. John, now retired, stayed active by golfing, though his heart problems had slowed him down. Alice, still lively for her age, took pride in keeping their home in order. Their marriage had faced its challenges, but it had settled into a comfortable routine over the years. At least, that's what John thought. Lately, Alice had been restless. She wasn't content with the slow, peaceful pace of their retirement. While John thought they had adapted to his health issues and a quieter lifestyle, Alice's dissatisfaction had been growing. John, blind to her feelings, didn't notice the emotional gap widening between them, a gap that was about to invite something unexpected into their lives. One rainy morning, John's usual golf game was cancelled. With nothing else to do, he headed home earlier than planned. He didn't bother to call ahead, why would he? It was just a normal day, or so he thought. But as soon as he walked through the door, he knew something was off. He found Alice standing in the living room, wrapped in a pink silk robe, smiling awkwardly with a much younger man by her side. John froze. He had no idea what to say, his eyes moving between Alice and the stranger. The man, Mark, couldn't have been more than 30, maybe 35. Tall, fit, probably some former college athlete by the looks of him, he didn't belong in John's home, not with John's wife. Alice, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, tried to kiss John on the cheek as if this were all completely normal. But John pulled away, disgust written all over his face. "Are you out of your mind, Alice?" he growled, his voice low but sharp. "I'd rather not know where your mouth's been, though I can guess." Alice looked taken aback for a moment, but quickly brushed it off, like she had been caught sneaking an extra piece of cake instead of standing half-naked with another man. She introduced the man casually, as if this was just a routine social visit. "John, this is Mark. He's a friend." Mark, still standing with a smug grin, had the nerve to step forward and place a hand on John's shoulder. "Nice to meet you, Mr. John," he said with that cocky smile that made John want to throw him out then and there. "Don't worry, 25, 30 years from now, I'll probably have the same issues you're dealing with." John's fists clenched. He missed the intimacy with Alice, sure, but he never thought she'd step out on him like this. He thought they were fine. Adjusted, even. But seeing Mark's arrogance, this kid who clearly thought he had the upper hand, made John's blood boil. "Mark," John said, his voice calm but laced with menace, "get out of my house. And if I see you here again, I'll eliminate you. I've got a weapon." The smile dropped from Mark's face instantly. He backed away, mumbling something about thinking it was okay, and left without another word. John stood there, staring at Alice in disbelief. She didn't seem shaken by any of it. If anything, she looked irritated that John had interrupted. "That was rude, John," she said, crossing her arms. "Rude?" John's voice rose with disbelief. "I walk in on you with some guy you've been screwing, and I'm the one who's rude?" Alice's expression softened, and she stepped forward, reaching for John's shoulder, but he stepped back. "I'm sorry, John," she said softly, though her voice lacked real regret. "What we had was nice, but it wasn't enough for me." John shook his head, trying to comprehend what she was saying. "You could have told me that. Where did you even find this guy?" "He's a friend of Marjorie's," Alice replied nonchalantly. "She didn't want him, so she gave me his info." "Marjorie's throwaways?" "He's using you for easy sex, Alice." "Maybe," she admitted with a shrug. "But I'm using him, too. So what difference does it make?" John couldn't believe what he was hearing. "How long has this been going on?" "A few months. He comes over when you're golfing, takes care of me, and leaves before you get back. It doesn't affect you. You get your exercise, I get mine." John's mind reeled. Suddenly, it all made sense. why Saturdays had become linen-changing days. "I don't care if I'm not here," John spat, the anger rising again. "I'm done with this. I'll give up golf if I have to." Alice rolled her eyes. "John, be smart. You need your golf. This works for both of us. Maybe for you, Josephine. But not for me. This was the last time." John stormed upstairs to shower, hoping to wash away the anger and betrayal that clung to him. By the time he came back down, the house was quiet, empty. Alice had left without a word, probably to their daughter Emily's house. Fine by him. He needed space, too. As the water ran over his face in the shower, John's anger cooled into something colder, resolve. Alice might have convinced herself this was fine, but John wasn't going to accept it. He couldn't. This wasn't just about some random guy, it was about the betrayal, the lies, the destruction of their marriage. He would never have done this to her, and he sure as hell wasn't going to just accept it. The next few days after Alice left were a strange mix of anger, confusion, and emptiness for John. He kept replaying the confrontation in his mind, each time feeling that same surge of disbelief and betrayal. 40 years together, and now this? He never imagined Alice, of all people, would be capable of such blatant disrespect. John tried to go about his routine. He went golfing, as usual, but the game felt empty. His friends noticed something was off, asking him why he seemed distracted, but he brushed them off with excuses about his health. No way was he about to admit what had really happened. It was too humiliating to tell anyone, especially after all the years he'd spent building a solid reputation as a loyal husband, a family man. Now, it was all a joke. He spent most of his time thinking about what to do next. Divorce? Could he really go through with that at this stage of his life? They had built an entire life together, a home, children, grandchildren. The idea of tearing all of that apart seemed unbearable. But the alternative, living with the knowledge that Alice had no respect for their marriage, that she'd just invited some younger guy into their home, seemed even worse. One afternoon, John decided he couldn't sit around waiting for things to magically fix themselves. He needed to confront Alice again, this time with a clear head. If nothing else, he needed answers. He needed to know if there was even a chance they could salvage anything, or if their marriage was well and truly over. When Alice came home that evening, acting like everything was perfectly normal, John knew he couldn't hold back any longer. She walked in, carrying bags from the grocery store, not even acknowledging the tension that had been hanging over them since the day he'd found her with Mark. "Alice, we need to talk," John said firmly, his voice steady but laced with frustration. She looked at him, raising an eyebrow like he was overreacting. "About what?" John couldn't believe how casual she was being, how utterly unaffected she seemed by the fact that she had torn their marriage apart. "You know what? About Mark. About what the hell's going on with us." She sighed, setting the bags down on the kitchen counter. "John, we've been over this. I told you, it's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" John snapped, his voice rising. "You've been sneaking around behind my back with some guy half your age, and you think that's not a big deal?" Alice crossed her arms, leaning against the counter with an air of indifference. "I'm not sneaking around. You're gone all day at the golf course, doing whatever you want. This works for me. It's not like I'm running off and leaving you. That's your excuse. I'm gone golfing, so you get to bring another man into our house." John could hardly believe what he was hearing. Her complete lack of remorse, her casual dismissal of everything they had built, was more than he could take. "I'm not asking for permission, John," Alice said coldly. "We've been married for 40 years. I think I'm entitled to a little freedom at this point." John shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "Freedom? This isn't freedom, Alice, it's betrayal. You don't get to make up your own rules just because you're bored." She looked at him, her expression hardening. Bet John'll. Don't act like you've been some perfect husband, John. We both know there were times when you weren't exactly attentive. John's jaw clenched. Don't you dare turn this on me. I've been here, I've been loyal. I've never once stepped out on you, even when things got tough. You made a vow, just like I did. Alice rolled her eyes. Vows? That was 40 years ago, John. People change. I've changed. I'm not the same woman I was when we got married, and you're not the same man. John stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and sadness wash over him. So, what now? You just keep doing this? Keep having your fun with Mark, while I what? Sit around and pretend it's all fine. Alice didn't answer right away. She seemed to be weighing her words, trying to figure out how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. Look, John. I'm not asking you to accept this. I know it's not what you want. But I'm not going to stop. I need this. I need something more. John stood there, feeling the weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't going to stop. This wasn't a one-time thing, or some temporary phase. Alice had made her decision, and John realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had no control over it. So that's it, then? John asked quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. You're choosing him over me? She shook her head. It's not about choosing, John. It's about me. It's about what I need. John turned away from her, his mind spinning. He couldn't believe it had come to this. 40 years of marriage, reduced to nothing more than a selfish pursuit of what she wanted, with no regard for what it meant for him, for their family. He had loved her, he had stood by her through everything, and now, she was throwing it all away for some fleeting thrill. I need some air, John muttered, grabbing his coat and walking out the front door before she could say another word. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, John felt a wave of emotions crashing down on him, anger, sadness, Bet John'll. He had always thought their marriage was solid, that they had weathered the storms together and come out stronger. But now, standing there alone, he realized he had been wrong. Alice didn't see their life together the way he did. She had outgrown him, moved on without even bothering to tell him. John walked for what felt like hours, the cold night air doing little to numb the storm brewing inside him. 40 years of marriage, and it all boiled down to this. He couldn't wrap his head around it, how Alice could throw away everything they'd built together so casually, so heartlessly. He found himself at a small park, one of those quiet places where families brought their kids during the day. But at this hour, it was empty, just dim streetlights casting long shadows over the benches and swings. John sat down on a bench, staring out into the darkness, his thoughts racing. How had he missed this? The signs had been there, of course. Alice had been pulling away for months, maybe even longer. But he'd chalked it up to the natural slowing down that came with age, with routine. He had thought they were just settling into a quieter phase of life. Apparently, Alice had other plans. John thought back to their early years together, their wedding day, the birth of their kids, all the challenges they had faced as a team. They had survived so much, raising Emily and David, going through tough times with his job, her health scares, and even the deaths of their parents. Each time, they had pulled through, stronger. Or so he had believed. But somewhere along the way, Alice had drifted, and he hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had noticed, but he didn't want to admit it. He had convinced himself they were solid, that they had weathered the worst and come out the other side. But what he hadn't realized was that Alice was already gone, emotionally, at least. And now, there was some guy named Mark taking his place. John rubbed his hands over his face, letting out a heavy sigh. What was he supposed to do now? Divorce? At his age? It seemed ridiculous. They had kids, grandkids, what would they think? Emily, especially, would be heartbroken. She idolized her mother, always talking about what a perfect role model Alice had been growing up. How could John destroy that image by telling her the truth? But the alternative, staying in this sham of a marriage, pretending that everything was fine, seemed unbearable. Alice had made it clear she wasn't going to stop. She didn't care about his feelings, didn't care about the life they had built together. She only cared about what she wanted, and that was freedom, freedom from their marriage, from him. He couldn't live like that. The next day, John made a decision. He couldn't keep running away from this, pretending like things would fix themselves. He needed help. He needed someone to talk to, someone who could give him some clarity, some guidance. And there was only one person who came to mind. Emily. He dreaded the conversation. Telling his daughter that her mother was cheating, that their marriage was falling apart, was the last thing he wanted to do. But he couldn't keep this bottled up any longer. He couldn't carry the weight of it alone. John called her that afternoon, his voice steady but tense. "Emily, can we meet for lunch tomorrow? There's something I need to talk to you about." Emily's response was cheerful, as usual, oblivious to the storm brewing on her father's side of the phone. "Of course, Dad. What's up? You sound serious." "I'll explain when we meet," John replied, trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. "It's important." The next day, they met at a small cafe near Emily's office. She was all smiles when she arrived, greeting him with a hug and her usual energy. But John could hardly keep up the facade. The weight of what he had to say hung over him like a dark cloud, and as they sat down to order, Emily quickly picked up on his mood. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, her smile fading into concern. "You're not yourself. Is it your health? Is something wrong with Mom?" John hesitated, his heart heavy. He hadn't prepared for this conversation, hadn't thought through the right way to break the news. But now that he was here, there was no turning back. "It's not about my health," he began slowly, carefully choosing his words. It's about your mother." Emily's face shifted from concern to confusion. "Mom? What's wrong with her? Is she sick?" John shook his head. "No, she's not sick. But something's happened. Something I never thought I'd have to tell you." Emily leaned in, her eyes searching his face for answers. "What is it, Dad? You're scaring me." John took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Your mother, she's been seeing someone else." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold, like a slap across the face. Emily's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across her face. "What? No. No, that can't be right." John nodded, his voice cracking. "I wish it wasn't. But I caught her. I found her with him, in our house. His name's Mark. He's younger, and John paused, struggling to get the words out, she admitted it. Emily stared at him, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. Mom did that?" John nodded, watching as his daughter's world crumbled right in front of him. "I'm sorry, Emily. I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't want you to know at all. But I didn't know what else to do." Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. How could she do this? After everything? You've been married for 40 years. This doesn't make any sense. John reached across the table, taking her hand. "I don't understand it either, sweetheart. But it's happening. She's not the woman we thought she was. She's changed." They sat there in silence for a moment, both trying to process the enormity of it all. Emily wiped at her tears, struggling to hold it together. "What are you going to do?" John sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know. I can't live like this, but I don't want to tear our family apart either. I don't know what to do." Emily squeezed his hand, her voice soft but determined. You don't deserve this, Dad. You need to do what's right for you. And if that means walking away, then you have to do it. John nodded, appreciating her words, but knowing the decision wasn't that simple. I'll think about it, he said quietly, his mind still reeling from the weight of it all. As they parted ways that afternoon, John felt a small sense of relief. At least now he wasn't carrying the burden alone. Emily knew, and no matter what happened next, he knew she would be there for him. But the road ahead was still unclear, and the choices he had to make would shape the rest of his life. The days that followed John's conversation with Emily were quieter, but the weight of his decision still pressed heavily on him. He spent his time reflecting, trying to figure out what the right move was. Divorce felt like the obvious option, but the idea of tearing his family apart, especially at his age, made it feel like too much to bear. 40 years of marriage weren't something you could just walk away from without a second thought. But then again, Alice had already walked away, hadn't she? Emotionally, at least. She was living her own life now, making her own decisions without caring about the impact on John, or their kids. She didn't even seem to think she had done anything wrong. One evening, John decided he couldn't put off confronting Alice any longer. He had to make it clear that things couldn't continue like this. When she walked through the front door that night, casually dropping her purse on the counter like she hadn't just spent the day doing who knows what, John was already sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for her. "We need to talk," John said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of everything that had been building inside him. Alice glanced at him, raising an eyebrow like she wasn't in the mood for another conversation about the situation. She sighed and sat down across from him, clearly irritated. "John, I thought we already went over this." "No," John said, shaking his head. "We haven't. Not really. You seem to think that I'm just going to accept this. That I'm going to keep living in the same house, pretending everything's fine while you go off with him." Alice didn't flinch. She didn't even look guilty. If anything, she seemed annoyed. "John, I told you, this doesn't change anything for you. Why are you making such a big deal out of it? I'm not leaving you." "But you have left me, Alice," John shot back, his voice rising. "You've already walked out on our marriage, even if you haven't packed your bags. You're not here." "Not really." She rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed. "John, you're being dramatic. You're retired, you have your hobbies, your golf. I have mine. We don't have to do everything together." John stared at her, stunned by her cold indifference. "This isn't about hobbies. This is about trust, about respect, about the fact that you've been cheating on me right under my nose." Alice's lips curled into a smirk, but it wasn't one of guilt or regret. It was one of pity, like she thought John was being naive. "Cheating? John, I'm not running off with him. I'm not leaving you for him. It's just something for me. Something that makes me feel good. What's wrong with that?" John's jaw clenched as he struggled to keep his anger in check. "What's wrong with that? You've bet-Johned me, Alice. You've bet-Johned everything we built together." Alice sighed, rubbing her temples like she was dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "John, you're stuck in the past. People change. I've changed. I'm not that 20-year-old girl you married all those years ago. And I'm not asking you to be," John replied, his voice softer now, though the hurt was still clear. "But I didn't change my vows, Alice. I didn't walk out on us." She stared at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke, her voice flat and emotionless. "Look, John, I don't know what you want me to say. I'm not going to stop seeing Mark. I told you that. I'm not going to change who I am just because you're uncomfortable with it." John shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "So, that's it? You're not even going to try to fix this?" Alice looked at him, her face calm and unbothered. "I don't think it's broken, John." "You do. That was all John needed to hear. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Then I guess there's nothing left to say. Alice didn't move, didn't argue. She just watched as John walked away, heading upstairs to the bedroom. As he packed a small bag with clothes, the reality of the situation sank in deeper. Their marriage was over, even if neither of them had officially said it. There was nothing left to salvage. Alice had made her choice, and now John had to make his. John drove to Emily's house that night. He didn't want to face the silence of his own home anymore. When he arrived, Emily opened the door and immediately knew something had changed. She hugged him tightly, no words needed to be exchanged for her to know how serious it had become. I couldn't do it anymore, John admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. She doesn't care. She doesn't even think what she's doing is wrong. Emily nodded, leading him inside. I'm sorry, Dad. You don't deserve this. They sat together in the living room, the air thick with unspoken grief. John knew this was the end, but the pain of it still hung in the background, like an unwanted guest at a family gathering. Have you thought about what comes next? Emily asked gently. John let out a long breath. I think I have to leave her. I don't see any other way. Emily didn't argue. She knew there was no fixing this, no easy solution that would mend the deep fractures in their family. Do you want me to be there when you tell her? John shook his head. No. I have to do this on my own. The next morning, John returned home, the silence in the house overwhelming. He found Alice in the living room, flipping through a magazine, as if nothing had happened. The sight of her acting so normal, so unbothered by what they were going through, only fueled John's resolve. He sat down across from her, the room heavy with unspoken words. Finally, John broke the silence. I'm leaving, Alice. She looked up, her face expressionless. Leaving? John nodded. I'm filing for divorce. I can't do this anymore. I won't. For the first time, something flickered in Alice's eyes. Maybe it was surprise, or maybe it was anger. But it was brief. She didn't argue, didn't try to stop him. Fine, she said simply, her voice cold. John felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He had expected more of a fight from her, some sign that she cared, but there was none. And maybe that was for the best. Goodbye, Alice, John said softly as he stood up, grabbing his bag. Alice didn't respond. She just watched him walk out the door, the final chapter of their life together closing with a quiet thud. John walked out of the house for what he knew would be the last time. He didn't look back. The cool morning air greeted him as he closed the door on a lifetime he thought he'd never have to leave behind. 40 years of marriage reduced to nothing more than a cold exchange and an indifferent goodbye. As he drove away, the familiar streets of his neighborhood blurred past him. Everything seemed strangely distant now, as if the weight of all those years was finally lifting off his shoulders. But the heaviness of what he had lost, the life he thought he knew, the future he had counted on, still clung to him like a shadow. He hadn't expected it to end like this. After all they'd been through, all the fights they'd survived, John never imagined that indifference would be what finally broke them. He thought there'd be a fight, or tears, or at least some regret from Alice. But there was nothing. Just that one word, fine. It was like the decades they had spent together didn't mean anything to her. The road stretched ahead of him, and with each mile he drove, John felt something inside him slowly shift. The hurt was still there, deep and raw, but alongside it came a quiet relief. He didn't have to live with her Journal anymore. He didn't have to wake up every day wondering what she was doing, where she was, or who she was with. He was free. That night, John stayed at Emily's house. She and David had been his support system throughout all of this, and though they were both devastated by the breakdown of their parents' marriage, they stood by him. Emily made him dinner, trying her best to lift his spirits. David called from out of town, offering his support, his voice heavy with concern for his father. "Dad, I know this is tough," David said over the phone, "but you're doing the right thing. You deserve better than what she gave you." John nodded, even though his son couldn't see it. "Thanks, David. I know. I never thought it would end like this." "It's going to be okay," David assured him. "We're here for you." After the call, John sat with Emily in the living room, the house quiet around them. The hum of the TV played softly in the background, but neither of them was really watching. They didn't need to say much. The unspoken understanding between father and daughter filled the space where words couldn't. A few weeks passed, and John's life began to settle into a new routine. The divorce papers were filed, and Alice didn't put up any resistance. She signed them without a fight, just like she had agreed to everything else. For her, it was as simple as moving on, but for John, it was the end of a lifetime he had spent building. John spent more time with his grandkids, finding solace in their laughter and energy. He threw himself into his golf games, using the sport to clear his head, to focus on something other than the empty house he no longer returned to. He took Emily's advice and started seeing a counselor, something he never thought he'd do. But it helped. Talking to someone who wasn't part of the family, someone who could listen without judgment, allowed him to process the grief, the anger, and ultimately, the acceptance. One afternoon, as John sat on the back porch of Emily's house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized something. He wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness that had gripped him for so long had faded, replaced by something quieter. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was close. He still thought about Alice, of course. How could he not? 40 years don't disappear overnight. But those memories, once painful, no longer carried the same sting. They were just that, memories. And as much as they hurt, they were a part of his story, a chapter that had finally come to a close. Emily joined him on the porch, sitting beside him in the fading light. "You okay, Dad?" she asked gently. John smiled at her, a small but genuine smile. "Yeah. I think I am." They sat there in silence for a while, the cool breeze carrying the sounds of the neighborhood around them. It wasn't the life John had planned, but in that moment, he realized it was a life he could live with. The future, uncertain as it was, didn't feel so heavy anymore. As the sun set on another day, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope for what was next, for whatever lay beyond the wreckage of his marriage. He wasn't sure where life would take him from here, but for the first time, he was ready to find out. He was ready to start again. And that, John thought, was enough.